We want to give a special welcome tonight to a writer who always seems to tell us the story that we need the most, just when we need to hear it. For 4 decades, J. Michael Straczynski has been telling tales of the lost and forgotten, the overlooked, the ones who are or feel like outcasts and loners, looking at the world from the shadows. In Superman Earth 1, a newcomer, an alien, who is both infinitely powerful but also infinitely lost, finds his place in the 21st century. In Midnight Nation, a man and a woman walk the breadth of America looking for hope among the hopeless. In Changeling, nominated for multiple Academy Awards, a woman tells a story no one wants to hear over and over, insisting on its truth even though no one is listening. On Babylon 5, he spun 2,500,000 tons of metal around a 5-year story arc of war and its echoes and its aftershocks. And in Sense8, human connection spans the world and eventually begins to save it from itself. That's without listing his credits on everything from the real Ghostbusters to Murder, She Wrote. It would be easier to list the awards he has yet to win than the ones he has, including the Emmy, Hugo, Eisner, Saturn, Nebula, and an asteroid discovered in 1992 at the Kitt Peak National Observatory that was honorarily named 8379 Straczynski. Tonight we're here to talk about becoming Superman, about how all that work and all that life came to be, but if we might add one more consequence of his writing to that list, I, and I'm sure many of you, sincerely believe that his work at different points in our lives gave us hope, lifted us up, took us to the stars, and kept us alive. We all may be the universe made manifest, figuring itself out, but we've had a great deal of help from you, sir. Thank you.
That was a hell of an introduction. I don't need that kind of pressure. FYI, before you even get started,
Of course.
in that room a moment ago, I typed on Jerry Siegels' typewriter. I've never been so nervous because when I was in high school, again, all we really had was manual typewriters for the most part. And I was in creative writing class with Joanne Massey, and she asked me to write some stuff for the magazine that we were putting out that semester, which is the first time I'd ever been writing things to get published, even on a small scale. And I'd have a typewriter bring with me, so she loaned me her typewriter from home. And the desks back then were these very light plastic seats, everything underneath for books, and a tabletop that came around. And I had the typewriter that I'm working, I realized I'm out of paper. I get up to go to get some more paper. The typewriter weighed more than the desk. Flipped the desk.
Yeah.
Sent the typewriter smashing into the floor, keys going in every direction.
Oh, no.
I'm just horrified looking at this. And she's trying to compose herself. It's okay, it's all right. I have a spare at home, I'll bring it in tomorrow. Don't feel bad about this. So the next day she brings it, I'm working on the typewriter, I'm thinking about all this great stuff, and oh, I'm out of paper. A second time.
Oh, no.
I killed 2 typewriters in 2 days. This is how stupid I am. When I'm in the writing mode, everything else disappears, including my perceptions of gravity.
We have field trip students who come in very frequently and love the typewriters here, and anyone my age or older is like, please just don't make me write a term paper on that thing. So I wanted to talk with you a little bit about, some of the writers, first of all, that you were inspired by or identified with. You talk in your memoir a lot about finding home in books and in stories. And so, can you tell us some of the people that, you found comfort and identification with?
Yeah, for me, I'm a nerd, so I came up on science fiction first and foremost. I remember one of the first books I ever read was a Ray Bradbury novel, and a collection, The Martian Chronicles, and an Isaac Asimov collection. And I was just amazed. I'd seen science fiction on TV, but always kids science fiction and dopey things that didn't make any kind of sense. But there was some real thought in there, like, oh my gosh. And when I watched The Twilight Zone for the first time you were exposed to Rod Serling's words coming at you, you're looking at a wall of genius, but they hit you in the face. And it was just stunning to just sit there, and we couldn't stop it because technology didn't exist then. I'd be writing as fast as I can to get it all down. And then I went out one summer and sold a lot of you could sell seeds, for gardens, for flowers, and make some money that way. And I did a whole bunch of seed selling. Now we call it, I don't know, having your own dispensary. And got enough to get a cheap audio recorder, tape recorder. And I would tape record whole episode of Trials, and I would just write down everything he wrote and said, just to feel what it felt like to write that good, And hold it, and just look into the corners of his mind through the words and see how it all winnowed out and think, I don't know who this guy is, but he has a brain like a machine. And so that and Richard Matheson and Patty Chayefsky, and what I grew up reading his stuff, and just, the pantheon of science fiction and fantasy.
It almost sounded, when I was reading those parts of your book, that you were sort of assembling your own curriculum. You were sort of teaching yourself the things that you needed to know to become what you wanted to be.
Yeah, that's correct, because, again, where I went to schools, mostly, inner city, not the best environments, where your job options were working at a gas station, or grocery store, crime, prison, or death. Those were kind of your choices.
So a range.
Yes. And so the teachers never really bothered giving them more than the minimum required that they had to do. And so, you're absolutely correct. I began making my own curriculum of writers that I studied, and I started teaching myself Latin at one point when I was like 9 years old, because why not?
Indeed.
Didn't stick, but it was fun to learn, because you go into the whole Indo-European word derivation from there. And just, I used to transcribe. Also, when I was in Catholic school, whenever I would disobey or be out of touch, or being a bad guy, there's one school you had to transcribe a page of the dictionary as your punishment, or multiple pages of the dictionary. By the time I got out of there, I was on G.
Oh no.
So my vocabulary to G is really good. After that, not so much.
So this is the Writers' Museum, so I need to ask you,
I'm an exhibit here, by the way, just so you know.
Process.
Come see me whenever you like.
So I need to ask you a process question. What about form and timing? Why a memoir, and why now?
Well, there's a window of opportunity when you can write a memoir and when you shouldn't. It's like, if you write it at too young, you're presumptuous. I'm 25 years old, here's my autobiography. Or if you wait too long, there's other dangers, because you reach that point where, all you can remember are the things that never actually happened. And your main concern isn't telling your story, it's about finding out which of the other residents stole your pudding. That's the main concern you have at a certain... And I'm right between those two right now, leaning toward pudding. And I also realized that, as I mentioned it a couple of times elsewhere, I've kind of done fandom a disservice, and I was realizing that by not expressing, when I say to people, if I can do it, anybody can do it, what that actually means, because they didn't know the context. Well, let's get this down now. Well, I'm still more or less, they haven't pulled the plugs in my brain out yet, and get this down on paper and see what happens. And I thought that, a genre guy writing a genre bio would get the genre press. And I was as astonished as anybody else when we had this huge coverage in New York Times, Washington Post, NPR, the Wall Street frickin' Journal. Like, oh, what the dragon noticed me. Like, oh, shit.
Without giving the entire book away,
I die at the end in a fiery plane crash of Buddy Holly and a Big Bopper.
Rocks fall, everyone dies. But in addition to exposing these decades of abuse and poverty that you and other members of your family went through, you discovered some really terrible family secrets. And you talked in interviews about taking a sort of journalistic approach to your own story. And I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about why you made that choice, if it was a choice, and if you felt that it, did it help you, did it hinder you?
Overall, I tried to take a step back emotionally from what I was writing and just treat it as a piece of reportage with commentary, because what I didn't want it to be was a poor me, sob story kind of a situation. I've lived through it, and I have processed it, and I'm not, broken by it. I just, with that and with the story of what my father did during the war and all the other stuff, I thought, I need to pull back emotion, let the reader feel that. There's the thing when you're an actor. Actors learn not to cry on camera if at all possible, because if the actor don't cry, and it's very emotional, you force the audience to cry. If the actor cries, they take the burden away from the audience. So I'm just going to tell the story the way it happened and let it go from there.
I'm sure plenty of people have asked you about the reaction of your family to the book, and I do want to know about that, and I also want to know about how you feel about it now that it is out in the world and it is getting all of this wonderful coverage and universally, rave reviews.
I don't really have much family to have feedback to me. My middle sister, who read the early version of it, who was, discovered things about it that I didn't know, and her responses to me, I found things I didn't know. My youngest sister, we don't really talk, and there's really no one left in my family except my Uncle Ted, who was one step removed, my uncle's brother. So there isn't much family to hear from. In terms of my reaction to the response I've been getting, I had prepared myself for the book to come out, or thought I was, but when I saw the reviews, imagine, if you will, you're sitting at home one day and you turn on the television or pick up the newspaper, and there are people you don't know talking about your personal life in ways that are kind of judgy, Seems kind of self-righteous, or she's like, pain in the ass, and it's got the millions of people, and they're all talking about you. And that part I wasn't really prepared for. I was like, oh, Jesus, what have I done? So that kind of weirded me out, and I kind of slept for like 24 hours when I saw that stuff happening. Yeah. So
did writing the memoir make you reconsider any of your other previous work? I mean, I was reading it on a plane to Seattle, and at one point I put it down and I thought about the line in, I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe it's In Comes the Inquisitor, when Delenn is saying, "This body is only a shell, you can't touch me." Reading it in the context of knowing all of this is a completely different experience. Did you know what you were writing all those years, or did this make you look back on anything differently?
I think a lot of what happens when you're a writer is transparent to you, because you're in the fishbowl and you really can't see it. I knew that there were certain themes that I wanted to touch upon in all of my work that comes out of where I come from. The notion that we are better together than we are apart, that the common coin of our shared humanity is stronger than whatever can defeat us, that we are better than we think and nobler than we know. The major chords were there, but the example you mentioned just now, that goes right back to when I used to get beat up by bullies in the street. I would just, I would curl up, and I think they can't hurt me, they can't get to the part of me that matters. And this is just, the physical shell, which is why I have a really high pain threshold, because I've separated my body out from my brain. Writers are like sapling trees. If you pour like red food dye around the ground of a sapling tree, it'll grow up with that kind of red color in the bark, and you absorb everything. And the tree isn't necessarily aware of the red coloration. It's just there as part of it. So I think everything that goes through a writer comes out the filter of that experience. Every person in this room, everything you've gone through and experienced, has created a lens in the middle of your forehead that nobody else has. No one else, has that point of view, which is why those of you who are aspiring writers yourselves must understand that, if diamonds have value because they are rare, how much more rare is a point of view? And whenever I hire a writer, I'm hiring them for their perspective and their point of view. I hire them for the dye in their bark that makes them unique from everyone else, the lens in the middle of their head. And sometimes you're aware of what you're doing, sometimes you're not. And oddly enough, sometimes not being aware is better, because you're not thinking about it. The writing process, for me, is like, imagine you're a ballroom, and there's one person dancing over there, and he's doing a fine job, but you can see him in his head going 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. And the other end of the ballroom is Fred Astaire. He's just dancing. There's trying to dance, and there's dancing. There's trying to write, and there's writing. Once it becomes effortless, once you get out of your own way and just let the writing happen, it becomes amazing. You don't make art happen, you let art happen.
So you...
The sound of one fan clapping.
It was a few more than.
All right.
You talk in the book about the sense of distance from others that you developed as a defense mechanism, as a response to what you were going through. And is that at odds with the generosity and the openness that you've shown your fans and the compassion that you show your characters?
I think that they're on parallel tracks. I come from the ranks of fans. I'm as rank as any of you. So I always thought, how would I like to be treated if, Rod Serling was making a show now? What would I like to hear from him? Would I like that kind of involvement or engagement? And consequently, I try and treat it that way. The characters are what the characters are. So you have to be brutal to your characters sometimes. Sometimes you have to be nice to them. But it's all about, just dialing into the reality of what those characters are. I don't write. I transcribe. I open up a window and I see what the characters are doing and I write it down. Because it's got just that transparent for me that, it just happens over there and that's pretty funny, and then I write that down.
So you talk about, growing up as a fan and coming from that world. And, before we had prestige TV, science fiction and animation and comic books were doing really heavy lifting in terms of tackling social issues and addressing really big topics. And, do you still feel that that's the case?
That the TV is addressing significant issues?
That science fiction is still where you find a lot of the big questions being answered.
Yes and no. I came up during the new wave science fiction stage, which was very much about political issues and sociological issues. And it's my sense that in the last 20 years, science fiction's got kind of insular. It does near future stuff. It doesn't tend to go out much beyond that. And it's gotten very safe and non-political for the most part. Not saying completely, but I'm saying on average. It's, adventurous stuff or it's, interesting ideas. But I'm not saying the same kind of engagement with the culture that we saw in the 60s and 70s. So I think that we need to switch the dial up a little bit, because the role of science fiction is to, to look over the horizon and do you like what's coming at you? When you're living everyday life and you get caught up in paying bills or doing a job or raising a family and things are going wrong, you tend to look at your feet all the time because you don't want to stumble. Everything's going weird around you. Whereas, science fiction's job is to lift your eyes to the horizon and wake you up out of that and say, is that what you like, what's coming at you?
The story of writing the screenplay for Changeling was, to me, one of the most incredible parts of the book. You had this story that you'd heard about that just wouldn't leave you alone until you wrote it. And I was wondering if you could kind of tell us about that process.
Well, it illuminates the number one notion I've always tried to convey to new writers, is that everything that you write and finish, I add that as a caveat, you must finish it. That was a familiar laugh. Called you out, didn't I? That you finish gives you a tool you didn't have before, a tool that allows you to write the next thing better than the last thing you wrote, and then to look back at what you've done previously and see where the flaws are. If you don't finish it, you don't get those tools. And for me, on Changeling, every time I tried to come at that story, I did not have the tool set I needed to write it. I tried it as a novel, I tried it as a TV series or miniseries, on and on. And it's like, I am just completely inept. And even though I was, writing for a living, the specific tools for that story I did not have until I reached the point where I was driven by desperation. I finally had enough experience to say, I think I now can do this. And that's when I wrote it and sold it, and it became a thing suddenly.
Yeah. So you sold it to Clint Eastwood.
Well, I sold it to Ron Howard originally, who then was going to direct it, but he couldn't do it for his schedule. Then we brought on Clint Eastwood, and then Angelina Jolie, and all of a sudden we're making this thing. And I had been not working much as a TV writer for the last 3 years before this. And when they announced it in the trades, my agent's phone blew up because I didn't understand that when an A-list producer and director and star bless your work by coming onto it, suddenly transmutes you from an out-of-work television writer to an A-list writer. And I didn't know how to handle that. except to laugh a lot. And that changed my life in substantial ways. And I believe in the notion of the Prince from a Distant Land scenario, if you want to be a writer, which is to work in lots of different areas at the same time. Because what happens is, movie studios work with screenwriters all the time. They don't have a lot of respect for them necessarily. TV studios or networks work with TV writers all the time. Comics publishers work with comic writers. They're used to it. They're not impressed by you. But a TV writer going into comics is a Prince from a Distant Land, and suddenly gets new respect. A comic writer going into movies, oddly enough, has a different kind of respect. Ooh, we know what you do. You make pictures, and we can see them, which is the average executive response. And a movie writer going into TV is like, oh shit, come on, give us your ideas. So the importance of maintaining a career as a writer is to constantly be reinventing yourself and to understand the notion of the Prince from a Distant Land, and that will keep you always going.
We hear a lot especially from younger writers, about the pressure to create a brand, to get known for one thing and you make that your thing. And you've got so many things. Was there ever that pressure to specialize, to say, all right, this is what I'm doing?
Oh, constantly. In film in particular, here's the trap that they lure you into. If you write, let's say, an action movie and it does really well and they pay you $500,000, then the next one you write, they'll pay you $600,000 because you establish yourself in this field. If you do the action movie for $500,000 and you do a romance, they will drop down. They'll pay you less money because you haven't proven yourself in that area. So there's a huge pressure to stay inside your lane. The problem is that, I'm a big believer in crop rotation, or in my case, crap rotation, I suppose. That everything feeds into everything else. And, you can't hit a moving target. So for me, I always try and keep moving through different forms and different genres because it keeps you fresh as a writer. I know a number, when I first came to LA in 1981, there were about a dozen writers I knew who were kind of the hot shits at that time, working mainly in TV, some in animation. And as of almost like 10 years ago, there's not one of them still working as writers. Not one. Because they defined themselves to death. They said, this is the kind of writer I am, this is the kind of stories I tell, and I would tell them, well, no, try this, write a play, do that, and nothing. And they lived in a box, and they died in a box, because that's what boxes are for. And the main reason I'm still here and making a living, despite all odds to the contrary, is I like to keep experimenting, trying different forms. I just sold a novel to Simon & Schuster, which is a mainstream drama, completely way outside my usual purview, written in epistolary form, which those of you who know means written in journal entries and diaries and voicemails and texts and everything else. It could not possibly go more broadly wrong at this point. Also about a controversial subject, but again, you've got to stay fresh as a writer. You've got to keep challenging yourself.
There's a coherence between the constant movement in your childhood, the changing that you were forced to do, and with that in your career as well.
Yeah, I don't have much of an attention span, for one thing. But the changing of locations, when I was growing up, I moved 21 times the first 17 years, forced me to adapt to different circumstances, but also provided me with writing and storytelling as continuity. Because we'd be living in Matawan, New Jersey, and I'd be reading a Ray Bradbury book, Something Wicked This Way comes on page 19. We'd move to Newark, New Jersey, go to the library, same book, same cover, page 20, and keep reading. So even though I didn't have continuity in the rest of my life, fiction and storytelling provided me with a continuity. It provided me with something to stand on when I had nothing else. But that being said, I also realized that, again, going back to the question of recurring themes, in Superman, the monthly book, he was walking across the country. Midnight Nation, they're walking across the country. In this novel I just sold, there's a cross-country trek. Okay, I'm done. I realize, I see the pattern now. I can't do that anymore.
Yeah. The book ends with you, reaching out to others who may feel, as you once did, that you've been knocked down just too many times, and saying to them, get up, keep fighting. Is that what you hope that we all take away from this?
I hope so. There are so many forces out there that prey on young writers and young artists of all stripes. The tyranny of reasonable voices of those, your friends or your family, who don't want to see you fail. Because in American culture, there's nothing worse than failure. But what that fails to understand is that failure is an important part of the process. What the military says in particular, that if you don't fail once in a while, you're not doing it right. You try and get over the wall, you can't do it, you learn what your mistakes were, next time you go over it. If you're not, trying something new, if you're not, willing to risk failure, you're never going to achieve anything. And you'll be stuck in one box forever, and instead of having, 10 years of experience, I have 1 year of experience 10 times. And the horrible thing would be to reach the age of 80 and look back at your life as a catalog of missed opportunities. And it's never too late, for some of the audience and others, to understand that you can always make that change. I have a friend, for dubious words, but I have a friend, who I've known since college. And about 4 years ago, she called me very upset. She'd been working for the state of California for 30 years in a cubicle, pushing around pieces of paper. And she said, and there's nothing of me in there anywhere. And I'm 52 years old. It's too late to be anything else. And this is my story. I said, well, I don't believe that for number one. You can always, become what you want to be in the first place. I said, what are you passionate about? What do you care about? And she said, well, I like my pets. Okay, what else you got? Well, I like taking pictures. I'm not a professional photographer, but I like taking photos. Why don't you combine those two and do pet photography? You can do it for your friends, for vets, for shelters, and over time you can be making a living. I haven't got a camera. I'll get you a camera. But if I start now, it'll take me at least 3 years to get established, and I'll be 55 years old by then. I said, well, how old will you be in 3 years if you don't do it? 55. How come the same? So we got the camera, and she took lessons, began doing it, phasing down slowly her hours at the state of California, until now she makes a living full-time doing what she loves. She spends her time taking pictures of cats and dogs and emus or whatever the hell else it is, and is happier than she's ever been. We all fall asleep in our own lives at some point, till something wakes us up. A marriage, a birth, a death, a diagnosis, a prognosis, and suddenly for the first time you're awake and alive in your own life. And that's the moment when you have to ask, is this what I really want to do? And what I want with this book is to challenge anyone who reads this to say, are you really doing what you want? When you were in high school, you were to come out and change the world on your graduation day, did you see yourself working at Walmart? Is that what you really want? Because believe it or not, greater and more impressive and amazing things are possible for you if you try and do it. Over the years on Babylon 5, I would hear from people who, seeing the notion of choice and change being possible, quit their jobs and went after other things. And Troy, you did the same thing. We came work for us. Suddenly discovered that they can actually make a living from their passion. There's this notion that if you do what you love, it's a hobby. If you do what you hate, it's a job. But if you could make, choose between making a moderate living doing what you love or a better living doing what you hate, which would you choose? And have you chosen appropriately? And if I can make that choice with no discernible personality and a face that only Homeland Security could love, anybody in this room who's probably hipper and smarter and more talented than I am could do it. So there.
I wanted to ask if there was anything that you wanted to read before we got to questions.
Oh God, no. You don't want to see me read or hear me read anything. I wrote it for those who got the audio version. I wrote specifically an introduction for Peter Jurasik to read, to explain why he was doing it and I wasn't, including the fact that I'm terrified of reading my own stuff. At one point, he says, he's a nice guy, but he has a voice like a sea lion with a slight New Jersey accent. And it's true. So, oh, no, these are nice people. I wouldn't do that to them.
Well, and just because you're a good writer doesn't always make you a good,
Oh no, I'm
voice
incompetent
actor,
at everything else.
Yeah.
I fall in the category of sensitive zebra. If you heard about this or not.
No.
This is the role of the writer in society or the artist in society. They did a study of zebra behavior, and what they did was they studied them and they discovered that most of the time, 90% of the herd just doing zebra stuff. They're hanging out in the forest, chasing things, texting, whatever the hell they're doing. And like 5% of the zebras are on the edge of the herd like this, watching everything. And they're the first ones to see the lion. And what happens is they see the lion, they take off, and everyone follows them. And that's the role of the art. And then, of course, except for the one zebra who slept in that day and gets eaten. That's the role of the artist or the writer in society, to look down the horizon, see what's happening, and write about it and warn everyone else or celebrate it with everyone else. Writers write to figure things out. It's like for me, growing up, writing was where I figured out, I tried to make my life make sense because I didn't make any kind of goddamn sense the way it was. I had to try and make my life make sense, and stories do that. Narrative provides meaning, or sometimes meaning provides narrative. And writers try and figure things out. Writers are sensitive zebras.
So don't be the zebra that slept in, is what
Yes.
we're saying. Well, while we're passing out note cards and getting them back, the reason I asked if you wanted to read something was there was actually something that, not to go all this is your life on you, to read to you. Oh no.
I'm running for the exit already.
Oh no. But something that.
If that was true, time travel is a thing.
Oh no. But there's something that you had written that I had gone looking for many times over the years and went looking for again earlier today, and the entire listserv is from Babylon 5 is still online because no one ever gives up a domain. Why would you?
Even in prison, you get time off for good behavior.
But there was something that you wrote at the end that said, the most any writer can ever ask for is to tell a tale worth telling. To make people cry, to make people laugh, and even once in a while make them think about things and see the world just a little differently than when they began. Is that still how you feel? Is that still true?
Oh, yeah. The job of any artist is to touch passion, not be burned by it, and come back and tell others what it felt like. You want the audience to feel something. That's the whole purpose of telling a story. You want to communicate not just a fact, not just the plot. The difference between story and incident is the king died and the queen died, and story is the king died and the queen died of grief. It's the emotion that makes it a story. And you want to affect people, and you want to change people, and you want to get across to them in ways that sometimes take your breath away when they come back. A few years ago, I got email from a gentleman saying that when his daughter was born, he said troubled. He didn't go into specifics, he said she was troubled, like 2 or 3. And she was always in motion and wouldn't slow down. And he said the only time she would ever just sit and be quiet was during Babylon 5. And he had no idea why. And he said, I would put her in my lap, and for the time that the show was on, I could just be a dad for an hour. And he said, why don't you know, she passed away not long ago. And when my wife's asleep upstairs, he said, I'll come down and I'll put a Babylon 5 episode on and I'll put a pillow in my lap. I remember what it was to just be a dad for an hour. And, how do you hear that and remain unchanged? That person was affected on a profound level.
So we've got quite a few questions here.
I don't
care. The first is about Sense8. Is there anything anything of Sense8's setting or world building that you wish the fans got to find out?
Not that springs to mind offhand. We told as much of that story as we could within the time period that we had. What was kind of interesting with things that happened behind the scenes in many respects. We were shooting in Iceland, which is an amazing, amazing country, beautiful. And I don't know if you know this or not, but they believe in the elves in Iceland. They build freeways around elf habitats. And while we were there doing location scouting, say at the 101 Hotel in downtown Reykjavik, about 2 blocks down, they were digging a foundation for a new building, and it's a lot of, they hit a boulder they couldn't move because it's not a lot of soil there. It's all hard volcanic rock and moss. They couldn't move this boulder, so they assumed, as you or I would, elves. And they brought in this woman whose job is an elf translator. I want that job. I want to grow up someday to be an elf translator. She went to the boulder, talked to the elves, what's wrong, what's going on, too much noise to confusion, we want to be somewhere else, quiet with a nice view. They went to the Reykjavik City Council and asked for money to relocate the elves. And they said, but of course. So 2 days later, I'm watching this whole thing unfold. The 16-wheeler flatbed pulls up. Now they can move the boulder, go figure. And they put the boulder on the truck. She opens the box up, does a little prayer, the elves get in. They drive her, the box, and the boulder across Iceland to a nice beach, nice view, quiet. Drop the boulder. She opens up the box, does a little prayer. The elves get out, and everyone's happy. And I thought, this is the best country in the world.
Our next question is from Lauren. She-Ra, Princess of Power was a political story that we needed in the 80s. And how do you feel, you touch on this a little bit in your book, but how do you feel about the reboot, and more importantly, why do we need her story now?
Art is in the process of constantly being reinvented. So I was very pleased to see them reinvent She-Ra for Netflix. It serves a purpose now for younger viewers to give them a sense of power and authority and autonomy and agency. In other words, that don't begin with the letter A. So I'm very happy to see. I think that I have not watched as much of it as I would have liked because I've been busy writing my brains out. But I think it is serving an important purpose for new fans now.
So what is your revision process like?
For me, the first draft is just me telling the story to myself, because oftentimes a story will change under your hands as you're writing it, and you have to give in to the story. The story knows what it wants to be. Your job is to get out of the way and let the story happen. And by the time I'm finished, there's this, I can see in the seams of the story, this tug of war between me and the story trying to tell itself. So I began sanding out my ego and letting only the parts of the story that make sense survive. So I start out saying everything I can say about a subject. I file it down to everything I want to say about a subject. I sand it down again to everything I need to say about the subject, so that when you're done, it's smooth like glass. I very rarely add to the work in the revision process. It's almost 90% of the time is taking stuff out, clarifying points, letting the work speak for itself, not trying to force the characters to do something, letting them do what they want to do. Ursula Le Guin talked about the fact that she was writing this novel, and at 200-page point, the main character who she thought the story was about died. And she realized then that no, the story wasn't about him, it's been about her the whole time. And then when you get to the end, you go back and you now make all this make sense, you make it all line up properly. But that's when the story reveals itself, and you have no control over that.
How important do you believe it is for long-running characters like those you've written in comics to grow and progress as characters, versus how important is it to retain what they were like in their beginning? Is there tension there?
I think one doesn't preclude the other. I think it is totally possible to let characters grow and change over time, but still remain essentially who they are. I mean, everyone in this room, except for you, has changed over time and become better than you were, a few years ago. You are still essentially who you are and who you were 10 years ago. You're just more now, potentially, your true self. As you've sanded away the notion in high school you have to be a certain way, in college you tried to fit in with the sororities, and now you're at the point where you sanded it, that's silly, I'm just gonna be who I am now. But you are still your essential self. When I work on books like Spider-Man or any other long-term franchise, my job is to sort of creak open the door and see what has not been touched before that lets me expand upon the character without contradicting the character. So when I came on to Spidey originally, my thought was everyone knows that the spider gave Peter Parker his powers. Everyone in this room is familiar with that, except you. I have no idea who you are, I'm just picking on you, sorry. But I thought, well, hang on, back up the whoa-whoa train for a second. Did the spider try to bite Peter before it lost the powers it had in the first place, so the radiation was what's going to kill it? Or did the radiation give the spider the powers that it was then going to get to Peter? Which came first, the power or the radiation? And when you ask that question, suddenly you start to think, oh wait, hang on. If the spider was trying to get to Peter before the radiation killed it, is there a spider motivation? Is there a spider totem, a spider god, a spider CPA, whatever it is, that is pushing this forward? And when you ask that question, you suddenly realize that, wait a second, most of his villains are based on animals. It's Doc Ock, the Killer Croc, the Vulture, on and on and on. They're all animal-based. Maybe there's like a larger totemistic thing going on here. You don't contradict the character, but you dig deep and you find out things that maybe no one ever thought before. So you can grow them, change them, but not contradict them.
It seems that in American culture today, there's a loss of value for empathy. And is our current art, writing, film, et cetera, is it a reflection of that? Or is it a factor in it? And how do we use art to change that? That's a question from Trevor.
Yeah, I mean, it's easy as a writer. The simplest thing to do is to be dark and dystopian and depressing. Again, these again. I don't know, alliteration's a thing today, apparently. It's easy to do that. It's much more difficult to be optimistic or to be hopeful. And one thing that's always run through my work from day one has been the notion of hope and change and possibility. And particularly, as you were saying, the question of empathy. And what people tend to forget is that empathy is the core root of civilization. When you are in a small tribe, that tribe is your community. You have empathy for the members of your tribe and your own personal family, and the tribe across the river are the bad guys. Then you go across the river one day and you meet them, and not so bad, you exchange some fish. And then suddenly you have empathy for the tribe across the river. Now you have a larger tribe. But the ones over the mountain are the enemy. As empathy spreads, civilization spreads. As empathy decreases, civilization begins to pull back and to topple. And we fall back on the rules of the tribe, of conflict. So I think that more than anything else right now, we are in desperate need of empathy and storytelling, which was, again, one of the reasons we made Sense8, which was to say that, you may think someone in Nairobi is so different from you, but if you could be in that person's head, living their life legitimately for a day or whatever it is, you might discover that they're not that different, that they want to find love and to have purpose and have a family and to achieve joy. They're not that different. And that was the whole message behind Sense8, was one of empathy and understanding and community.
So we're going to do one more and then move to the signing portion of the evening. This is a question from Suzanne, and I apologize, Suzanne, but I'm going to add on to your question a little bit. She asks, what other genres do you enjoy? And I'm going to add, in what art and artists do you find inspiration right now?
My reading at the moment has fallen down because of all the work that I'm doing. And I love all genres. One thing I love the most is one that I can't do, which is poetry. I suck at poetry. It's horrible. And that's why I like it. I can't do it. And poetry, I admire the precision of it. There's no room for error in poetry. You can't pick the word on the shelf next to the right word. It has to be the right word. And the thing I learned about writing a long time ago is that the more precise you are and the smaller you are, oddly enough, the more universal it becomes. You think that if you write big, everyone will dial into that. No, the smaller you write, the more down to the particulate matter you get, the more easy it is to understand. When I was working on Twilight Zone, I was writing an episode where I wanted this older married couple to fight, and later on she gets killed and he regrets it. And I said to my friend Harlan Ellison, what should they argue about? Like rent, should be, politics. He said, jams and jellies. What? She said, it was a thing between them where in the morning at breakfast, he would say, pass me the jam, dear, and she'd say, here's the jelly. And it was a game they would play when they was in a bad mood, and they had an argument about it, and she went off, and she got in an accident, she died. And he regretted that stupid argument the rest of his life. You go small, you go intimate. And when you can do that, suddenly everything becomes more elegant. I worked with Jim Cameron for a while, a couple years ago, and he said one of the smartest things I'd ever heard about writing science fiction. He said, I used to think that writing science fiction was about writing familiar characters in unfamiliar settings. It took me 10 years, he said, to realize I was wrong. It's familiar relationships in unfamiliar settings. So Terminator 2 is a father-son relationship, even though it's not. Aliens is a mother-daughter relationship, even though it's not. Because you may not be able to buy into galaxies, spanning stories, or robots, or time travel, but you can buy into that relationship. It's on a very human level. And the smaller you can go with the writing, the more down to the detail, the more it becomes universal. The bigger it is, the less universal. The smaller it is, the more universal.
Well, thank you so much for being here with us tonight and sharing all of that with us.